At my father's steakhouse toast, he slid a brass nameplate Clerk across the linen and said I'd never be more. I'm Rowan Hale, 55, a forensic auditor. The AC's cold breath and burnt ribeye smell hit harder than his laugh. That plate's welded into a glass case now. Want to hear the ledger that got it there? Chrisman's chop house smelled like charred ribeye and old money pretending it had just been minted. Ceiling fans turned slow as courtroom clocks. My father raised his glass ice, ticking against crystal, and said loud enough for the waiter to pause mid-pour, "Rowan will never be more than a clerk." The table laughed the way people do when they've already chosen a side. In front of me, a brass nameplate Clerk. RK. Hale caught the amber light and threw it back at my face like a verdict already signed. I didn't say anything. I watched the shine on the plate the way the serif on the C had a tiny nick in it, as if someone had tried to sand it down and given up. Caspian slid his iPad between the creamed spinach and the mashed potatoes and began a small TED Talk about capital stacks and SPVs and real growth, the sort of language that sounds like steel until you touch it and realize it's tinfoil. He took a sip of bourbon he hadn't paid for and tapped to a slide with an arrow that went up and to the right, like hope on a good day. Why did the administrative variance in the pension plan round to exactly 0.85% 3 quarters in a row, I asked, because I was still technically on payroll to ask questions like that. My father didn't look up from his steak. "Clerk's file," he said, sawing through the meat strategist's decide. The server refilled his glass, careful not to spill, as if what might end up on the table could be charged to my account. Maida Lynn's pearls clicked against the rim of her water glass, a metronome of agreement. I said nothing because there are fights you win loud and fights you win in silence. It took me 55 years to learn the difference. When the bill came, my mother signed without reading. The nameplate had been placed in front of me like a complimentary mint you don't need. I wiped a smear of steak juice off the L with my thumb, slipped the plate into my jacket, and stood. "I'll get the door," I said, because someone always does. Helena's evening air smelled of pine resin and warm dust. The sky over the valley held on to the last thin line of pink, like it wasn't ready to let go. I drove with the windows cracked, counting the streetlights, as they passed 12 from the chop house to the turn toward my place, 3 more to my driveway. It's funny the numbers you remember when people tell you you're only built to count. Inside the house clicked and settled the way old houses do when they're deciding whether to trust you. I set the brass plate on my desk next to a naked black binder and a stack of unopened envelopes from the firm's plan administrator. The binder didn't have a title. It had been waiting. I uncapped a marker and wrote 2 words on the whiteboard, the squeal of the felt like a small protest rules of engagement. Under that smaller, the thing I hadn't said out loud in 5 years Operation Ledger. The espresso machine hissed, filling the room with heat and impatience. I opened the encrypted drive on my laptop, Ledger what root, and watched the dots of the password march across the screen. Behind that, in my head, the old numbers began to arrange themselves, neat little soldiers in sensible columns, variances that lined up a little too cleanly, transfers that loved the end of quarter more than chance should allow acronyms that looked like companies, until you followed them to a P.O. box with peeling paint. I picked up the brass plate again. It was heavier than it looked. Funny how humiliation always is. I pressed record on my phone. The fan in the ceiling hummed like it was thinking about quitting. "My name is Rowan Keaton Hale," I said, voice a little rough from the steak and the bourbon I hadn't finished. "Initiate Operation Ledger." Saying initiate clicked something inside me I hadn't felt since the last time I stood up to a room that considered itself inevitable. There are words that are doors. Sometimes you only have to push. The first thing I pulled was a PDF of the pension fund's quarterly statement from 2017, because that was the year I'd first circled something in red and been told the ink was unbecoming. The second thing I pulled was the company org chart, the one where my title had been quietly revised from Chief Internal Auditor to Clerk of Audit Records, as if nouns could be mopped up and reapplied like stain. I took a breath, opened a blank spreadsheet, and typed the first column header date. A small start, but small starts are how houses are built and how empires are dismantled. My phone buzzed face down on the desk screen, lighting the wood from beneath. I let it ring once, twice. Habit is a kind of gravity. Mine had always pulled me toward silence. On the third buzz, I flipped it over. Unknown number. One line of text. You don't know the half of it. Call me. The espresso had gone cold. The house had gone still. Outside, a train horn bled across town long and low, the lonely sound of something heavy that still knew exactly where it was going. I looked at the brass plate again. For the first time, it didn't feel like a sentence. It felt like evidence. Winter 2017 came in dry and brittle, the kind that makes wood pop in the walls like it's remembering an older shape. I was in the back office after everyone had gone home, the building's heat turned down to the company's idea of thrift, when I saw it 0.85%. A neat little shave off the employee's pension ledger stamped administrative variance unsigned. Numbers don't whisper, but that one did. I printed the page and held it under the desk lamp. The toner sheen made the decimals glint. Administrative variances happen rounding timing fees that show up then get reversed, but they don't repeat with the precision of a metronome. I opened the previous quarter. 0.85%. The one before that. 0.85%. I could have admired the consistency if it hadn't been eating someone else's retirement. The next morning, Orrin sent a memo to streamline titles for clarity. I'd gone to lunch as Chief Internal Auditor and come back as Clerk of Audit Records. No pay change, he said, just less confusion for the org chart. Agility, he called it later in the hallway, clapping my shoulder like he'd promoted me to something lighter. Agility is what people in charge call it when they tighten the leash. I didn't argue. I made coffee the old drip machine that left a ring on the counter like a watermark, and reopened the archived emails, search terms variance administrative expense, smoothing, SPV. Caspian's name kept blooming in the CC lines like a bruise. His ventures, Gerfalcon Ventures, LLC Kestrel Holdings, names that sounded fast on paper, kept appearing near the variances like they were drawn by magnetic ink. That night, I signed up for a forensic accounting course that met Tuesdays and Thursdays in a tired classroom at the community college, the kind with a rail of humming fluorescent lights and a clock that skipped a second every minute. A retired auditor taught chain of custody like it was an art hash. Your files notarize your logs, back up what you're afraid to look at twice. I bought a black notebook ruled and wrote on the first page in small block letters, Private Logbook, Hale Pension. Underneath, no edits. Cross out Don't Delete. Helena in January leaks cold through the windows no matter how you tape them. My office smelled like old paper and the drafts that got rejected without being deleted. I stacked the 401k statements into months, rubber banded them into quarters. The rubber band snapped on the second stack, stinging my wrist. I circled 0.85% 3 times in red, then felt petty and circled it a fourth. On my computer, I opened a blank Excel file and named it without thinking, Hale Pension, Discrepancy Timeline, 2017-2024, Alice X. Naming a thing is a kind of promise. Caspian came by my office late one afternoon with a grin and a new pitch deck under his arm, the cover embossed like something expensive you'd sell to a board that liked gloss. SPVs are how we'll modernize the capital stack, he said, leaning against my doorframe like he'd invented leverage. We need to be nimble, Rowan. Money that doesn't move dies. Footnotes that don't exist kill too, I said, not looking up. He laughed like he hadn't heard me, patted the doorframe, and walked away, whistling something upbeat and tuneless. I wrote his name in the logbook, drew an arrow to SPV number 3, Gyrfalcon Ventures LLC, and underlined it twice. Around midnight on a Tuesday, the old desktop's fan shifted from a whine to a wheeze. I saved everything twice, then printed the transactional detail and spread it across the floor like a map of a war nobody had declared. The ledger's spine peeled in my hands, leaving a flake of fake leather under my thumbnail. Line by line, transfer by transfer, the pattern. Sharpened pension inflows got smoothed, variances pooled, and then in a neat series of hops funds moved to a shell, then another, then into a checking account with a name I knew too well. I stood up, knees complaining, and taped butcher paper to the wall. Pension fund on the left. SPV number 3, Gyrfalcon Ventures LLC in the middle. Caspian Hale, personal checking on the right. I pulled a red string from a drawer left over from a Christmas project Maida Lynn had roped me into and drew it taut from left to middle to right. It wasn't subtle. It wasn't art. It was the truth, loud and simple. The phone on my desk buzzed. I let it go to voicemail because I was tired of being interrupted by people who assumed they were the main thread. The machine clicked and whirred like it was clearing its throat. A woman's voice, older, careful. Mr. Hale, Senator Loretta Quinn here. Elias Bracken told me you're ready. Come tomorrow. I stared at the wall. Elias Bracken, retired Inspector General. The man I'd been reading footnotes from for years without ever shaking his hand. My breath fogged in front of me. The heat had cut off again the timer set by someone who trusted sweaters more than gas. I sat down, opened my CPA practice book, answered a set of questions about materiality thresholds, and circled 92% at the top of the page in a pen that skipped on every third stroke. In my logbook, I wrote, January 18th, 2018, first clean arrow, pension, SPV number 3, Caspian personal. 0.85% appears to be policy, not accident. I underlined policy so hard the page dented. Somewhere downstairs, the building's pipes clanked like they were settling an argument. I closed the ledger, pressed the cover flat, until the cracked spine complained and finally breathed. Ready, he'd told her. The word landed on my desk like a weight and a key. I looked at the red string. It held. Tomorrow, I thought, and flipped off the light. The cold followed me home, but for once it didn't get inside. The first thing Elias Bracken said to me in the Montana State Library wasn't hello. He looked at the binder under my arm, then at the USB drives in a Ziploc, and asked, "Do you have a chain of custody log?" His voice had the dry rasp of a man who'd spent a lifetime telling people the difference between what they knew and what they could prove. "I do," I said, sliding the black notebook from my coat. He didn't take it. He tilted his head the way a carpenter eyes a crooked beam. "Number every page. No ripped sheets. Cross out, don't erase. And if this is what I think it is, you don't need a family meeting. You need the state's chief counsel in your living room. Fluorescent lights flattened the stacks into a pale grid. Somewhere a microfilm machine hummed, turning history into gray fog. Snow melted off winter coats and bled cold through the carpet. I set the binder on the table. Elias didn't sit. He opened it, standing thumbed past my neat chronology, and shook his head. "Chronology is comfort," he said. "Intent to benefit is proof." He began to reorder the tabs. Red for movement of funds. Blue for authorization signatures, or the absence of them. Yellow for every place Caspian's ventures touched the pension. When you present, you don't tell them what happened first. You tell them why it happened at all and who got paid for it. I took notes like a first year again. Timestamp every export. Print PDFs to paper and sign the corner. Hash the drives, mirror the drives, store the mirrors in a separate physical location. Assume anything that can be misplaced will be, Elias said, and handed the notebook back. His fingernails were clean and short. The small things told you as much as the big ones. Senator Loretta Quinn joined us half an hour later in a wool coat the color of courthouse pews. She brought a staff lawyer who never said a word, only watched our hands move over documents. "My kitchen table is bigger than this," she said, glancing at the library's narrow desk. "Come on." Harlan thinks better with a bourbon in his hand anyway. Her house smelled like lemon oil and old victories. The table was scarred with years of elbows and coffee mugs. Rings marked counties, Harlan said, setting a glass down in a circle shaped like Gallatin. "He poured me one," said Son, and somehow it didn't sting. We spread the pages in concentric order fraud at the center, excuses radiating out. Elias showed me the ritual. 3-hole punch, the crisp percussion of each sheet a metronome for my breathing. Notary stamp, cold and decisive. A flash drive plugged into a laptop we'd disconnected from Wi-Fi checksum, calculated and written in my logbook, SAA 256, strings of calm alphanumeric chainmail. Mirror copy to a drive labeled in block letters with today's date and the word sealed. Senator Quinn's staffer slid each finished piece into an expanding folder labeled with a neat librarian's hand. "Now," Loretta said, already reaching for her phone, "you will need an adult in the room when you open this to your family, preferably one with subpoena power or close enough to scare them straight." She dialed. "Avery Loretta. I've got Rowan Hale with me. Ethics and fiduciary duty. Yes, the Hales. No, not the father. The son, the one with a spine." She handed me the phone. "Avery Myrick, Chief Counsel Ethics Committee." A voice said, quick and dry. "Senator Quinn says you're bringing a binder. If you convene your family, I'll come with a court reporter. You'll run the meeting. I'll make sure it counts." "Tomorrow," I said before I could think better of it. 1900, my father's living room. "Send me the agenda and the exhibits list tonight," Avery said. "Every item gets a yes or no. Do not let them apologize globally. Specific acts, specific answers." When the call ended, the room was quiet, except for the small crackle of the fireplace. Elias lifted his glass, but didn't drink. "Don't negotiate," he said. "Set terms." I drove back through a gray Helena afternoon that had given up on daylight. In my office, I opened my calendar, typed the subject line the way Elias would have family meeting, pension irregularities, admissions and terms. I attached the agenda, the exhibits index, the rules of engagement. I CC'd Avery. I hit send. The whoosh sounded like a latch sliding shut. The reply came 27 minutes later, time-stamped on letterhead acknowledged. Counsel will attend. Court reporter retained. I printed it, signed the corner, logged the time, slid it into a plastic sleeve. Procedure makes its own kind of warmth. My phone vibrated. Unknown number again. I almost let it go to voicemail. Almost. I answered on the third ring. Rowan. A woman's voice, thin and soft around the edges, like someone who didn't want to take up space she hadn't paid for. This is Rhea. Your Aunt Rhea. Your father told me not to bother you. He said you can't help. She stopped, drew a breath that rattled. He's wrong, isn't he? I looked at the wall where I'd rebuilt the red strings cleaner, now color-coded tabs matching Avery's index. Snow tapped the window like a pen against a pad. The 3-hole punch still sat open, jaws wide. Yes, Aunt Rhea, I said. He's wrong. Aunt Rhea's voice shook like a loose window pane in winter. I never saw the $800 you said you sent Rowan. Caspian was kind, though he fronted me $600. Said once his company took off, he'd cover the rest. $600. Out of my $4,800, branded as mercy. After I hung up, I reopened the family cloud archive and searched by sender. Maida Lynn Hale, Caspian Hale. Subject regarding Rowan's bonus, dated 3 years back. The body was short, tidy, and lethal. Rowan's bonus clears next week. Use the roof repair story again. He won't check. He trusts us too much. I stared at the sentence until the words split into separate betrayals. Won't check, trusts too much. Intent, not accident. Policy, not mistake. I drove to the FedEx office on Skelly Drive with a thumb drive in my pocket and the clerk plate wrapped in an old t-shirt on the passenger seat. The doors whooshed open and let in a knife of winter air. The place smelled like hot toner and cold plastic. A young clerk, kid, not clerk, took one look at the size of my print job and pointed me toward the self-service machines like he was triaging a minor emergency. I slid in the USB selected Hale Pension Review 2017-2024.pdf and watched the laser printer start spitting pages with a machine's confidence contracts, bank statements, emails with subject lines that sounded like euphemisms for theft. 247 pages later, warm paper stacked under my elbows, I moved to the work table and began to tab, index, and punch. Red tabs for transfers, blue for authorizations that never materialized, yellow for every time my name was used in service of someone else's story. The 3-hole punch gave off a small, satisfying percussion, a rhythm my breathing matched. I slid the pages into a heavy black binder and printed a new spine label on the store's cheap label maker, Ledger by Clerk, 001. Their word, my file. My phone buzzed. Avery Mirek, acknowledged. Counsel will attend. Court reporter retained. Please circulate agenda and exhibit index to all participants by 2100. I typed with my knuckles still ink-smudged, attaching the agenda and the rules of engagement verbal acknowledgement for each fraudulent act. No global apologies. No mistakes were made. Restitution plus interest formalized and notarized within 10 business days. Public apology to employees and to Aunt Rhea written and signed. Removal from all fiduciary roles effective immediately. Referral to Ethics Committee and Attorney General non-negotiable. I CC'd everyone who needed to be trapped by the CC line. Oren, Maida Lynn, Caspian, Avery. The court reporter Avery had brought into the thread a name I didn't know but found instantly comforting. I hit send, watched the spinning progress wheel, and felt the smallest, strangest warmth, the heat of procedure working. The phone rang again. Elias Bracken. "Don't negotiate," he said, as if we were mid-conversation. "Set terms." I told him. And I recorded the call with Aunt Rhea. "Good," he said. "But remember, the binder is your voice when theirs gets loud. Let it speak." By the time I left FedEx, the sky was a low slate lid scraping the tops of the street lamps. I carried the binder like a newborn, awkward reverent, afraid to trip on the curb. In the car, I unwrapped the brass plate and turned it over in my hands. The back was rough, the solder seam from a decades-old repair line still visible. It had always been patched. Just never, honestly. I was almost home when Caspian called. No greeting. "You wouldn't do this," he said, breath too close to the speaker. "Your family." I let the silence expand until he had to fill it with Rowan. "Are you there tomorrow?" I said, keeping my voice even like reading coordinates over a radio. 1900. The living room. "This is the last courtesy call you'll get from me. You're going to ruin everything Dad built." "No," I said. "You already did. I'm building the invoice." I hung up before I could hear him try on contrition like a jacket in the wrong size. At home, I cleared the dining table, pushed aside the old ledger with its peeling spine, and opened the binder to the first tab. The clerk plate sat on the tablecloth like a patient. I slid it into the last transparent pocket, the one reserved for exhibits that don't need numbers because they're not facts. They're symbols. I closed the rings. The metallic snap sounded bigger than it should have, like something sealed in a vault. I stood there a long minute, hands flat on the cover, feeling the faint warmth of paper just out of the printer. Somewhere in the house the heater kicked on and the vents rattled thinly their own kind of applause. I turned off the lights one by one until only the desk lamp lit the black binder, the brass plate shining dully through the plastic. Then I killed the lamp too, and the room went dark so fast it felt like a blackout order. Tomorrow at 1900, I thought. Not a conversation. Not a plea. An audit announced and witnessed. I went to bed with the cold of the FedEx floor still in my bones, and slept for the first time in months without waking to recheck a number I already knew by heart. When the call ended, I wrote the time and her name in the logbook. Then I underlined it once, careful and straight. Tomorrow at 1900 hours, the living room stops being a living room. And for the first time in 55 years, I wasn't afraid of our furniture. 7:00 p.m. Sharp. 4 straight-backed dining chairs in a hard square. The coffee table shoved against the wall. No snacks. No coffee. The thermostat set low enough that the floorboards breathed a thin, cold draft across our ankles. I put the black binder in the center of the rug and laid the brass clerk plate on top of it, the way a surgeon sets an instrument where everyone can see it. The grandfather clock in the hall ticked like a metronome for the transcript we hadn't started yet. Oren arrived first because kings don't like to be seen entering last. He took the chair opposite mine, the one with the best line of sight to the mantel where his framed awards sat. Maida Lynn followed Pearls, already trembling though her hands were steady. Caspian came last of the 3 shoulders bunched inside a jacket that tried to look expensive and almost made it. He kept his eyes on the plate. Good. Let it do some of the speaking. At 7:02 the doorbell rang. I didn't move. "Dad?" I said, and Orrin stood as if conditioned. He opened the door to Avery Myrick, Chief Counsel Ethics Committee, who stepped in with the neutrality of a winter wind. Behind him, a court reporter wheeled a slim case and set a small recorder on the end table. A red LED winked to life. The room shrank to the size of that light. "This is not a mediation," Avery said, setting a thin folder beside my binder. "This is a fact-finding with counsel present. Please answer with yes or no when prompted. Narrative may be recorded after admissions." He looked at me. "Mr. Hale, you convened. You chair." I opened the binder, the rings clicking loud in the quiet. "Agenda is before you," I said, sliding stapled packets to each of them. "We will proceed item by item. For each item, you will acknowledge or deny. There will be no global apologies." I turned to the first red tab. Item 1. Between June and October 2019. Pension funds totaling $20,000 were withdrawn in sub-10,000 increments, routed through SPV No. 3 Gerfalcon Ventures LLC, and deposited in part to an account ending 1142 registered to Caspian Hale. Exhibit 1A through 1F. Do you acknowledge? Caspian stared at the papers like they were in a language he claimed he spoke. His throat worked. Avery's voice cut through. "Lieutenant Hale." He stopped, corrected himself without looking at me. Mr. Hale answer, yes or no. A long rattling breath. Yes. The clock ticked. Snow scratched at the window. I slid the next tab forward, the red flags piling like spent brass. Item 2. May 12th, 2022. A $5,000 withdrawal labeled emergency roof repair moved next day to a venture line of credit controlled by Gerfalcon Ventures. Exhibit 2A through 2C. Orrin. My father straightened Sovereign wounded on his own carpet. Rowan, this house needed. Avery didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. Please answer yes or no. Orrin's jaw worked. Yes, he said finally, the word pushed out like a chipped tooth. I didn't look at him. Looking at him was how I'd lost ground for 55 years. Item 3, March 4th, 2021. A $4,800 transfer earmarked for medical expenses for Rhea Donnelly. Aunt Rhea was intercepted. $600 was later provided to her by Caspian Hale and represented as personal generosity. Exhibit 3A through 3E. Maida. My mother's eyes fell to her hands. The pearls clicked 1, 2, 3 as if keeping count of a prayer she didn't believe in. When she spoke, it was barely sound. Yes. The court reporter's keys clacked like distant gunfire. The recorder's LED pulsed. Outside, the wind shoved uselessly against the old glass. I turned the pages one after another, emails, transfers, board memos with my title crossed out as if nouns were erasable. Each time a yes. Sometimes immediately, often not. Each time, Avery's calm procedural voice drew the word out like a vein. Halfway down the stack, Caspian snapped. "We did it for the company's future," he said. Voice, rising, hands flat on his knees as if preparing to stand. "We had to look successful." "You." He jabbed a finger at me, then remembered the recorder and dropped it. "You don't understand how optics work." Avery glanced at the reporter. "That is an admission of motive for the record," he said, and nodded to me to proceed. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt tired. Tired and very, very clean. I slid red tab number 47 out, placed it on the small stack of completed admissions, and closed the binder. The clerk plate sat there in the circle of lamplight, catching my father's face upside down in its dull shine. "We will move to terms tomorrow morning," I said. 9 a.m. Mr. Merrick's office. Bring legal identification. I looked at each of them one by one the way you look at landmarks before you leave a town for good. Tonight was for the truth. Tomorrow is for the bill. Avery nodded once. 9:00 a.m. Sharp, he said, already standing, already folding back into the anonymity of process. The court reporter clicked the recorder off. The red LED died, and the room exhaled. Orrin looked smaller. Maida Lynn looked older. Caspian looked like someone finally seeing a mirror that didn't believe his story. I picked up the binder and the plate. The clock in the hall struck 7:30, each chime spacing itself into the quiet. I didn't offer to walk anyone to the door. I didn't ask if anyone needed water. "Counselor," I said to Avery, and he inclined his head in something that wasn't exactly respect, but wasn't not. At the threshold, I paused. "There will be no more phone calls tonight," I said. "All communication goes by email copied to counsel." Avery's eyes flicked to mine. Good, and then he was gone into the snow. When the door shut, the room felt like a stage after the actors have left props still in place. Heat-gone air settling. I rested my hand on the binder's spine and felt the faint texture of the label through the leatherette. Ledger. Clerk. 001. One file down, I thought. Tomorrow's signatures. 9:00 a.m. I repeated to no one, and left them sitting in their square of chairs. The clock still ticking the world outside, tightening under the crust of first snow. "I am no longer your son here," I said. "I'm your creditor, and the custodian of the people you defrauded." No one moved. The living room was the same as last night, but colder, as if the house itself understood what would be signed inside it. Avery's assistant set a neat stack of papers on the dining table we'd dragged into the square of chairs. Restitution and removal agreement sat on top in 12-point Times New Roman, the way all serious endings do. Yellow signature flags jutted out like warning triangles on a mountain road. The portable scanner on the side table gave a cheerful little beep as it powered up at odds with the way Orrin stared at me, jaw-set eyes small. Avery didn't bother with preamble. "We'll proceed section by section," he said, opening his thin folder. "Each signature will be scanned and time-stamped. This is a matter of public record." The court reporter set her machine on her lap and began to type the soft clatter like rain on sheet metal. I took the first page and read slowly, like loading chambers. Term 1. Full restitution of misappropriated funds. $87,450 plus interest at the statutory rate, amortized over 24 months, secured by lien on personal assets, as outlined in Appendix B. Orrin leaned forward. The motion practiced the old patriarchal gravitas in place. Rowan legacy doesn't. Avery didn't raise his voice. "Mr. Hale legacy is not a defense to fiduciary breach. Please address the term." Caspian's pen scratched first. His signature dragged ink pooling where his hand shook. A yellow flag came off the stack and fluttered into the ashtray we were using for spent tabs. Avery's assistant plucked it out and stuck it on the next page. Beep, scan, timestamp. The screen on the scanner read 09/07/13. I wrote it in my logbook. Term 2, I read. A formal written apology to all plan participants, and to Ms. Rhea Donnelly, acknowledging the specific acts admitted on the record yesterday. No global language, no passive verbs. Signatures from all parties to be circulated within 10 business days. Maida Lynn's hand went to her pearls, but they didn't rattle this morning. They just rested against her knuckles like they had finally given up trying to keep time. We only wanted the name to continue. She whispered eyes on the ink line where her husband had just written himself into accountability. You ended it, I said, steady. You ended it when you turned it into collateral. Her pen hovered, then touched down. The line of her signature wavered once and settled. Beep, scan timestamp. 09:10:02. Avery's assistant slid the signed page into a transparent sleeve and labeled it Apology, Draft Obligation, Term 3. I continued. Immediate removal of Orrin Hale and Caspian Hale from any and all fiduciary roles within the company and associated entities. Appointment of an independent trustee to oversee the plan during restitution. I passed the pages across. Orrin gripped the pen hard enough that it left a crescent in his finger. Halfway through his last name, the ink ran dry. He shook the pen. It left a scratch without pigment. Avery's assistant wordlessly handed him another uncapped. Orrin looked at me over the barrel of it. For a half-second, I saw not the man who'd renamed me a clerk, but a tired old father staring down a son he didn't know how to out-talk anymore. He signed. The new ink shone wet and dark. Beep scan timestamp. 09:16:44. Term 4. I said, referral of the full evidentiary package to the State Ethics Committee and the Office of the Attorney General. Cooperation required, including but not limited to sworn statements, production of personal financial records and testimony. Failure to comply constitutes breach and triggers immediate acceleration of the repayment schedule. Caspian's head snapped up. You said this was just between us. No, I said. You said that. I sent an agenda. Avery slid the referral page to him. Sign Mr. Hale. The court reporter didn't look up. Her fingers flew. Admission. Beep scan timestamp. 09:20:31. We worked through appendices, schedules of payments, security interests, an inventory of assets that would finally have to admit their purchase price. Post-it flags piled in the ashtray like spent matches. The room smelled of toner and old dust. My logbook page filled with Time's initials hash values. Procedure kept breathing evenly even when people didn't. At the bottom of the last page, there was a line for me. Not as son, not even as complainant, as creditor. I signed it, the ink steady. Avery initialed beside it, then straightened, closed his folder, and nodded to the assistant. Scan the full packet. The scanner took the pages one by one, chirping its small robotic approval. When it spit the final sheet back out, Avery looked at each of them in turn. We're done, he said. The word landed in the room with two meanings, verdict and funeral. Orrin sagged back into his chair and stared at a spot on the carpet, as if the pattern would tell him how to go back in time. Maida Lynn pressed her lips together until they whitened, then let them color again. Caspian rubbed the ink smudge on his thumb like he could erase the stain by spreading it thinner. I closed the binder. The clerk plate had been sitting off to the side, face up, catching a thin winter light. I picked it up, turned it over, and slid it into the binder's back pocket, the section for exhibits that had done their work. The plastic sleeve crinkled and went still. History not await. I stood tucking the binder under my arm, the logbook in my coat. "You'll receive the first invoice this afternoon," I said. "Your counsel will be copied. All further communication goes through email." I paused, not for effect, but for accuracy. "See you in the public record." Outside, Montana felt like a clean sheet of paper, flat white, waiting for whatever you were brave enough to write on it. The air burned my lungs in the good way. Behind me, the door clicked shut, the sound thin against the cold. I didn't look back. The black binder was warm against my side from the heat of signatures still drying. On the sidewalk, my phone buzzed. Avery Myrick packet filed. Ethics Committee acknowledged receipt. You'll get their formal letter within the week. I typed, "Thank you," and meant it in ways that had nothing to do with gratitude and everything to do with relief. I walked to my car past the old oak that used to drop leaves I raked every fall while Orrin talked about compound interest. The branches were bare and clean lines against a hard blue sky. The wind pushed at my coat, and I let it. Some things you brace against. Some things you let carry you exactly where you said you were going. The letter from the Ethics Committee arrived on a Monday cream paper state seal punched into it so deep you could feel the emboss with your thumb. Findings sustained, sanctions imposed, referral to the Attorney General. I read it standing at my kitchen counter, the kettle beginning to shriek behind me. By the time I poured the water, my phone vibrated with a calendar invite from a .gov address confirmation hearing scheduled. Attached was a PDF from Elias Bracken. Subject line on duty and blood. He'd never been poetic before. Maybe he'd earned it. Washington in early 2023 was all gray sky and wet wool. The committee room was paneled in wood, the color of old verdicts. Microphones glinted beneath studio lights. Pitchers of water sweated circles onto polished tables. The red light on the mic in front of me stared like a pupil. Senator Loretta Quinn sat to my left, composed as a statue. Across from her, an opposition senator thumbed through a stack of notes, as if he were going to find something in there that would explain me back into a box he preferred. I raised my right hand, swore in, and sat. The chair recognized Senator Quinn. "Mr. Hale," she said, voice steady. "Please describe briefly how this began." "I filed first against my own blood," I said. The words were simple and heavy. I discovered a pattern of variances in the employee's pension plan. I documented, mirrored, notarized. I asked for help only after the evidence could stand without my name on it. The opposition senator leaned into his mic. "Or you leveraged a family dispute to advance your career. Why should anyone believe this isn't vendetta dressed up as ethics?" I took a sip of water. It tasted like dust and metal. "Because vengeance doesn't timestamp backup, Senator," I said. "It doesn't invite a court reporter to the living room. It doesn't demand that every apology be specific. Loyalty is doing your duty for the people who can't defend themselves, even if it costs you every holiday you thought you were entitled to." He smirked. "Fine words. Fine procedure," I said, and nodded to Avery Myrick, seated behind me, already rising. He handed the clerk a gray box, our evidence on a drive, along with 3 bound copies of the packet. "Chain of custody is documented on pages 3 through 9, he said to the room at large. "Hash values on every export. Mirrored copies stored separately. The committee has full access." The clerk distributed the binders. Paper rustled like dry leaves. The red light on my mic stayed on patient. The chair cleared her throat. Without objection, she said the Ethics Committee's findings, sanctions, and referral are entered into the record. A junior staffer walked a printed letter to the dais. Senator Quinn put on her glasses and began to read. From Elias Bracken, Inspector General Retty. Mr. Hale's decision to prosecute truth before blood is not an act of disloyalty, but of fidelity to the oath he took to numbers and to the people whose numbers those were. There is a difference between keeping a family and keeping a family secret. She took her glasses off, folded them carefully, and set them on the table. The room absorbed the line without flinching. Questions came and went, policy precedent. Who would oversee the fund during restitution? An independent trustee already in place. Whether I believed my surname helped me, it did, until it didn't. I answered in the same voice I'd used when I called the first meeting to order at 1900 hours in a living room that no longer belonged to memory. Facts don't need volume. They need air. When it was over, the chair leaned into her mic. The committee will vote. The clerk called the roll, eyes stacked quietly. Nays came with speeches attached. The clerk did not write down the speeches. When the gavel came down, the red light on my mic went dark, and for the first time in months, I let my shoulders drop. Outside in the hallway, a monitor flickered C-SPAN blue. The crawl ran along the bottom like a small river carrying leaves. Committee recommends confirmation of Rowan K. Hale for Secretary of Commerce. I watched my name float past and kept waiting to feel something huge, a swell, a flood, a victory. Him. Instead, there was a long, clean silence where the noise used to be. Avery clapped me once on the shoulder. Next phase, he said. Different field, same rules. Loretta Quinn shook my hand. Get some rest before the circus, she said. Tomorrow, they'll ask you about jobs. Today was about character. I stepped outside into a damp D.C. afternoon that smelled like rain and exhaust, and the past being washed off buildings that were designed not to forget. My phone vibrated in my pocket. A text unadorned POTUS would like to intro. The president turned from the lectern, hand extended. Mr. Secretary, welcome. The East Room stood as one a rustle of fabric and protocol. Flashbulbs ricocheted off chandeliers and polished brass. And for a heartbeat, I saw every reflected shard of light as a decimal, a footnote, a tab I'd once color-coded red. I raised my right hand, swore the oath signed where the paper told me to sign. The pen scratched just a hair too dry, leaving a faint skip in the K of Keaton. When it was done, the applause was warm and brief, the way it should be for a job, not a coronation. Loretta Quinn caught my eye from the second row. Harlan gave me a tiny conspiratorial salute with the program. Off to the side stood Elias Bracken in a suit that looked older than the administration and sturdier. When the room began to move again, he crossed the carpet, took my shoulder in his hand, and squeezed once a pulse. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. In the inside pocket of my jacket, the velvet pouch sat against my ribs like a second heart. After the photographs, after the questions, will you prioritize jobs? How will you rebuild trust in the numbers? What about your family? To which I answered simply. We settled our accounts. I stepped into a small anteroom with a portrait of a president who'd liked statistics. I slipped the pouch open. The brass plate lay inside Clerk. R.K. Hale replated the old solder seam mended smooth. On the back, a new engraving cut clean through the shine. Not anymore. I ran a thumb over the tiny ridge of the weld and felt nothing catch. A week later, I was back in Helena. The wind came off the valley sharp enough to edit sentences. A modest storefront on Last Chance Gulch wore a fresh sign in hand-painted letters, "The Ledger Fund." Inside, the air smelled of cut pine and new paint. We'd built a display case from local lumber square, honest, nothing gilded. Behind the glass, mounted side by side, sat the restitution and removal agreement and the brass plate. A small card beneath read, "For everyone who was told they were just a clerk." The seam on the back was visible if you pressed your forehead close to the glass and squinted. I hoped people would. County clerks and city auditors came in their good jackets and their best jeans, faces lined with years of don't make trouble and be a team player. Eyes wet because somebody had finally said the quiet thing into a microphone that could hear it. We passed around coffee in paper cups that steamed the windows. The first application we reviewed was from a woman in a county I'd only ever driven through, who had documented a rigged procurement scheme and been reassigned to temporary records reconciliation for her trouble. I signed the first grant check. The pen slipped once, scratching the paper. I left the scratch. A straight line is nice. A true one is better. At the ribbon cutting, Loretta spoke about duty. Harlan told a story about a town that used to fudge its snowplow hours and how it stopped. Not because someone got sued, but because someone kept the ledger in ink and didn't apologize for it. Elias said nothing. He stood by the door, shook the hands that needed shaking, and nodded at the young ones, the way older soldiers nod at recruits they hope won't have to see what they saw. Reporters asked about forgiveness, about holidays, about whether I'd sit at a certain table again. We balanced the books, I said. Some debts don't invite interest after they're paid. I didn't mention the envelope that had arrived that morning, unmarked, the handwriting deliberate and unfamiliar. Inside a single line on plain paper, "I'm proud of you." Oh. No name, just the letter. I filed it under resolutions, not family. Accuracy matters in drawers, too. We kept the speeches short. This wasn't a memorial. It was a startup with a better definition of return. After the crowd thinned after the last handshake, after the photo of a dozen of us standing in front of the glass case with smiles that looked like exhalations, I locked the front door. The click echoed in the small room, then settled. Outside, Helena's night was brittle and blue, the kind of cold that makes everything honest. I stood on the sidewalk and looked through the window at the plate. The overhead lights turned the brass soft. It didn't look heavy anymore. It looked finished. My phone buzzed. A message from Avery First Quarterly Report template attached. "Let's teach them how to count out loud." I smiled, pocketed the phone, and started walking. The wind pushed at my coat. I let it. Some things you brace against. Some things you let carry you because you finally chose the direction. Behind me in the quiet storefront, the plate and the agreement sat still under glass. Two artifacts of a private war. No one else needed to fight now. Ahead of me, office lights blinked out one by one, until the street belonged to the kind of people who keep ledgers in ink, and don't mind the dark. "Deuce you personally." I stared at it, thumb hovering as a siren wound up somewhere far away, and then faded like someone else's emergency finally turning the corner. When the office is dark and the street is frost white, the old brass clerk plate sits under glass, catching a thin ribbon of morning sun, the weld line no longer a scar, just a seam of light. I learned that justice isn't revenge. It's paperwork boundaries and the courage to let consequences land where they should. Forgiveness doesn't always mean access and loyalty. Real loyalty is to the people who can't speak as loudly as the powerful do. Sometimes bridges collapse so we can learn which ones are worth rebuilding and how to cross them alone if we must. If any part of this sounds like your life in disguise, would you share what you reclaimed and how you knew it was time